Okay, so I shared a link to the Rambam Mishnah Torah. That's the Rambam's halachic writing, where it's the laws of the foundations of the Torah, Hilchot Yesodei Torah. I'm going to start by reading through the first 4 chapters there. It's going to take a while, but I'm going to move through it quickly. But before I do that, let me explain why I'm doing this. So first of all, everybody, welcome to everyone, and thank you for joining me again. And what in the Moreh Nevuchim, the place where we ended last time, let me do it in the, give me 1 second. I'm going to go, so we are in the Rambam's introduction. I'm going to put up a link to where we're up to. Hold on, I'm sorry. In the Pines English, the place where I'm up to is on page 8, the big chapter. Know that whenever one of the perfect wishes to mention, that's in the Pines English. In the English that's in the Sefaria, it's in the Guide for the Perplexed, introduction, prefatory remarks. And give me 1 second and I will find the chapter. It would be chapter number there's a number on there. It's really hard to maneuver through these. Boy, where is it? Give me a second. We're in the middle of the chapter. The English starts to read, the degrees in the perfection of men vary according to these distinctions concerning those who never beheld the light. It's that paragraph, and it's in the middle of that paragraph, which where we're up to. The same difficulty.
They have numbers on them.
They do?
Yeah, on the right side. I don't
know why I don't see it.
On Safari, yeah.
And if someone could figure out where we're up to in the Friedlander, that would help, because I want to. I'm in the Pines. We are on. I just told you guys, right?
Right.
Page 8. Okay, in 1. So that's what I was reading from. So the issue is as follows. Let me get started. So the Rambam is about to explain why the Torah speaks in parables. That's what he's going to do. And hopefully by the end of today's lecture, we'll have a chance to read his paragraph and understand why it speaks in parables. Why doesn't it just get to the point and say, Maaseh Bereshit, this is science. Why doesn't the Torah teach us science? If the Torah really is about, if Maaseh Bereshit is about nature and natural sciences, why can't the Torah teach us science? And also, why doesn't the Torah just teach us the Maaseh Merkava? If the Torah wants us to learn all these lofty ideas about God and so on, so say it, right? What's the big deal? Why not just say it? So, but before we get to understanding the Rambam's question, I want you to really get a sense for, and I know we touched on this last time, but I want to do this. So the link that I sent for the Rambam and Yesodei Torah is where he writes for the general public, and the irony of this is really kind of funny. He writes 4 chapters. In the beginning of Hilchot Yesodei Torah, Mishnah Torah was written for the general public. This was not written as a hidden book for only the select few. What are the basics of Maaseh Bereshit and the basics of Maaseh Merkava? What are the basics of the natural sciences and the basics of the divine science or philosophy? So let's look at chapter 1 in Yesodei Torah. And the Rambam labels them exactly the way he labels them in the book which we're reading now, Maaseh Bereshit and Maaseh Merkava. And after he explains it to us, he says, I'm not supposed to explain it to you, but he did anyway. So Yesod HaYesodos. This is the beginning of the Rambam. This the Rambam wrote in Hebrew, so I'll read from the Hebrew and translate. The foundation of the foundations, the Amud HaChachmos, and the foundation of all wisdom is laid out to know sheyesh sham matzui rishon. There is a first exister, or a prime mover in the Aristotelian language. V'hu mamtzi called Nimtza, and he's the one who brought about everything that there is. V'chol hanimtzoim mishamayim va'eretz, and everything that is found, every creation, everything that exists in the heavens and the earth, umasha binam, and everything between the heavens and the earth, lo nimtzu ela me'amitati matzo. They only exist because of the truth of his existence. If you should even imagine for a moment that there is no prime cause for everything, so there isn't, it would be impossible for there to be anything else. And if you think for a moment, and if you would think for a moment that everything in existence would suddenly cease to exist, he would still exist. He doesn't cease to exist because his creation ceased to exist. Everything that exists needs him, and he himself does not need them, and does not need any being within his creations. The truth of his existence is very different than the truth of the existence of everything else in the world. I'm going to skip a little bit. I just read to paragraph 3. I'm going to skip paragraph 4. And we're going to go to paragraph 5. This existence, hu Elohei Olam. This is the God of the universe. This existence I'm talking about is God. Adon Kol Haaretz, the master of all of the land. Hu Hamani Kagagal. He is the one that pushes the sphere, the great big sphere, which revolves, which is the motion that gives power to and energy to everything that exists. The strength that he has, there's no way to measure it, there's no way to understand it, there's no way to, there's no end to it. Knowing this, the Rambam says in paragraph 6, is the Yediat Davar Zeh, knowing this is the mitzvah of the Torah, Nochi Hashem Elokecha, I am the Lord your God. This is the commandment, I am God, and if you think anything else, that's Lo Yeh Elohim Achrim Al Panai. You should not have any other gods. Now I just read a large part of the first chapter. I'm going to skip a bunch. The Rambam brings a lot of verses and interprets them to mean, and these are verses that he will deal with a lot in our book as well, right? Which that just demonstrate that a lot of these verses, even though they might sound anthropomorphic in many ways, they're actually referring to God. I'm skipping to the beginning now of chapter 2. So hold on, I'm scrolling down. Let's go to chapter 2. This glorious and awesome God. It's a mitzvah to love him also and to fear him. You should love the Lord your God. And it also says that you should fear God. How does one come to love and fear this God? When you think about how great this creation is, a person has to think in God's creations, in everything that he's done, in his creations, that are so wondrous, and he sees the God's wisdom, there's no way to measure it. Once you get to this understanding, this level, that God's wisdom is so vast, it's so much beyond what we can comprehend, miyadhu ohev, immediately he comes to love and praise and have wonder for and have desire for more knowledge, leidah Hashem agadol, more knowledge about God. So this is the exercise. So now I'm going to scroll now down to the end. I know there's a lot here, but I just wanted you to get a sense for what he writes. And then if you look into paragraph 7 of chapter 2, he starts describing the angels and what they mean and so on. And then he goes on in the end of describing God's wisdom, until you get to paragraph 11. This is the key one I wanted to get to. These things that we just said, in these two chapters, are just like a drop in the sea. That's all they are. There's much, much more than just what I told you. And the description of all of the primary ideas that I just laid out for you, that is what is called the Ma'aseh Merkava, the workings of the chariot. Okay, so the Rambam lays out for us right here exactly what he means by Ma'aseh Merkava. The Rambam laid out all the basics, and he left himself an out by saying there's much more to it. So there's much more philosophy than the little bit that I just introduced you to. And then he says in chapter 12, in paragraph 12, not to describe these things only to a person who's intelligent, who's wise, and so on, because a lot of times people don't understand these ideas and they'll come to mistakes. Okay, so that's point number one. Rambam explained what Maaseh Merkava are. It's all these philosophical ideas about God. He laid out what the basics are for all to see. And then he says, but if you want to go into it deeper, you need to only do it with people that are capable of understanding the deeper thoughts and are more educated. Then the Rambam goes through another two prakim. Now here he goes into basic science of his day. I mean, today this would have been written by a physicist and an astronomer, but this is being written by the Rambam. Hagalgalim, the great spheres. It was understood then that the different parts of heaven were different spheres that rotated around, which counted for the movement of the heaven, and the energy generated by the rotation of the spheres was passed from the outer spheres to the inner spheres all the way down to earth. And every movement, every motion, every bit of energy was from the movement of these great spheres. Heim Hanikraim, the Rambam says, these are what's called the Shamayim, Varakia, Uzvul, Varavot. Those are the spheres, the names of the different spheres. There are 9 spheres. This is very standard, what science understood in Maimonides' day. Okay, so you can read through that. I'm not going to go through all the different names of the spheres and the planets which are in each sphere and the constellations in each sphere and so on and so forth. But he divides that out as you read through chapter 3. Counts them out, and then after going through the spheres and the stars, I'm still scrolling. Then he gets to the moon, the level of the moon in paragraph 10. Beneath the moon sphere, right, is he starts to explain the concepts of the tzura, of the forms, and he talks about the tzura of fire, the tzura of wind, the tzura of water, the tzura of the basic elements, the 4 basic elements in which is same as Aristotelian ideas: fire, water, wind, and I'm forgetting something, and earth. Okay, so he describes that those are the 4. Those are elements which don't have any soul, don't have any knowledge, and so on. And then he goes on to explain in chapter 4, after giving those 4 yisodos, then he says that out of that, everything on this world is created, from stones to animals to fish to flowers to trees. The whole world is made out of those 4 elements. And then he talks about the how the different things mix together. Now I'm skipping through most of chapter 4 now, because he describes energy, how things change, how one form changes to another, how fire changes to, so on and so forth, and that all of this is powered by the movement of the spheres. And then as we approach the end of that chapter, the Rambam says, and I'm going to get to it, give me a second, there's a lot of scrolling to do, to 10, to paragraph 10 in chapter 4 of Yesodei Torah. Kol hadvarim ha'elu, all of these things, shedibarnu b'inyan kemar midlihem, they're also like a drop in the bucket, right? Udvarim amukim, they're very deep. Not quite as deep as the first chapter and the second chapter, and But however, these two chapters, the third and the fourth, this is what's called Maaseh Bereshit. This is science, what we now today would call science. Go ahead, please.
Could I ask a question?
Please.
Does the Rambam understand, as modern scientists do, that he doesn't
Yes.
have a perfect understanding of how the world works, and that this is just the current best approximation and understanding that people have?
So that is a really good question, because the reason why that's a really good question, because it seems the way the Rambam talks, it seems like the Rambam seemed to feel like he already knew all that. Like this is the way it is. However, there are indications later in the book, and some scholars point out that the Rambam deliberately left a lot of openings because he understood that a lot of this science might change. There may be discoveries. So when the Rambam talks, he talks as if this is it, right? Like when you read what we just read, it sounds like these are the facts. However, there are many indications that seem clear. And go ahead. I see one more. Someone raise your hand, David.
Rachel. So he leaves himself some out. One of the things that he does do here relative to all of this is provide a structure, right? Which is that 1 and 2 are very literally foundation. 1 is foundational, 2 sits on top of it, 3 sits on 3 and 4 sit on top of that. Right.
That's a good point. Yeah.
Which is very sorry.
No, go ahead.
Which is consistent with his overall approach with the structure of the Mishnah Torah, which is to start with foundation and then go from that foundation into the details of all of that.
Yes. Now, yes, I agree. And the fact that he gives structure to this is important. It's very important. And it helps us, even if you change the facts of the science, we could still, when we approach Torah through the avenue of science, which is the Rambam was doing, we can build a different structure and do the same thing that the Rambam does. Basically do the same thing he does with a different science. But the question, it was a good one. And the answer, is that even though the Rambam speaks as if he knew everything that needed to be known about science, as if it was a solid fact, he does indicate that he understands. In other places in the book, he definitely does indicate that he understands that might change. So I wanted to bring these 4 prakim so that we see in a solid way what the Rambam felt was Maaseh Merkava, because we weren't so clear last time how he differentiates between these two. Now, by way of introduction to the paragraph that I hope we get to tonight, to continue in our Rambam's introduction to Mor Nevuchim, I'm making a couple other points. The Rambam says that this is Maaseh Merkava and this is Maaseh Bereshit. He uses those terms because Maaseh Merkava refers to specific chapters within Tanakh, specifically in Yechezkel, right? Which means that the Rambam is saying that what he said philosophically to be the truth, right, is in Tanakh, is in the Torah. That his Rambam's philosophy, now much of it seems very basic to us and is very consistent with what we always understood Jewish philosophy to be, but some of it is not. And there are things that are very Aristotelian, but the Rambam definitely thought that this was in the Torah. The second category, Maaseh Bereshit, he deliberately uses the term Maaseh Bereshit also, and he related this to us in what we've already read together, that is what all of his science is, according to the Rambam, in the Torah, right? That when the Torah teaches Bereshit, the Torah is teaching what the Rambam just described. Now, I want you to think about that, because it's not simple at all, right? So what the Rambam is saying is that this science that he believed was true is in the Torah. Now, I'm sure every single person on this call has at some point in their lives opened the Genesis, right? And read Bereshit. It doesn't say anything there about the 4 elements, right? It doesn't say anything there about the Galgalim, the spheres. It doesn't say anything there about almost anything the Rambam said. But the Rambam says that nonetheless, that is Maaseh Bereshit. So this should lead us to understand. Now we're starting to get a picture of why the Rambam is asking these questions and talking about how the Torah talks in parables. Because the Rambam sees these two things as the two foundations of the Torah that are actually in the Torah, but when you open the Torah, that's not what you read, right? So you open the Torah, and what do you read? You read Bereshit bara Elokim, in the beginning God created heaven and earth, and so on. You read all these interesting stories, but it doesn't say this. So now you can understand why this is such a big question. Why does this bother the Rambam so much that he has to give us all these explanations as to why the Torah talked in parables? Now, not only that, another point, I know that this has been said numerous times by the Rambam and by me. The Rambam said both of these, which are the Yesodos HaTorah, the foundations of the Torah, are both prohibited to teach. That should be extraordinarily striking, right? The two basics with which the Rambam started both of his basic books, his philosophy book, Moreh Nevuchim, that we're studying, right? And his halacha book, Mishnah Torah, that we just read part of. He starts off by laying out these two things that are the foundations of the Torah. And not only are they not written in the Torah, we're not even supposed to teach them. That's got to be strange. Like, what's that about? What do you mean that how could the Chazal tell us you're not supposed to teach? What do you mean you're not supposed to? This is the basic stuff. What could there possibly be more important to teach than this? And these are the things that we're not supposed to teach. Now, and then on top of that, all of these things, the Rambam himself does teach all the time. So these are the things. So now that we've established all of these things, we can move on a little bit. Okay. So what was that when the Rambam says that we were afraid of people misunderstanding things? What is the issue? What is he most worried about? Okay, so in Maseh Merkava, it's very clear. The Rambam is worried that when people study spiritual things and philosophy, they are going to use anthropomorphic terms to refer to godly or heavenly or spiritual matters, and they're going to start to think that they understand godly things, which according to the Rambam, by definition, we can't. It's such a different type of knowledge. It's such a different, the spiritual existence of God is so different from us that we can't. So anytime we start to describe it in human terms, right, or terms that we can understand, we already are misunderstanding it because we're using terms that are human. We're using terms that describe things. So this is the main thing, and we'll see this repeated over and over and over again. So the reason, according to the Rambam, why the Torah didn't describe spiritual matters directly was because the Torah was afraid that people would make a mistake and think that the Torah is referring to things that we can understand, and we can't. Now, what about science? What is it about science? And I'm going to lay this out now, and you're just going to have to trust me on this. But we'll see as we read through. You'll see that I'm right, I hope. And if you disagree, you'll tell me. But what was the Rambam? Why did he think most people can't understand science? And I think that's simple, because most people simply don't have the ability. Try to think for a moment, how many of us truly understand the theory of relativity, right? We can read Mishalim, we can read explanations that give us a little bit of a handle on what it means. But who really understands it? I don't know. Most people don't. So if we explain, and that's the relativity that we know today, the science that the Rambam was studying then, the vast majority of people that could have walked into the Rambam's office, so to speak, would have not understood any of these concepts. So the Rambam, therefore, is going to explain to us that the Torah, when the Torah described these ideas, the Torah described them in parables so that different people can understand them at different levels. And that's going to be what he's about to say. The Torah had to write it in this manner because this way, people that understand it on a lower level can get a little bit of a handle of the truth. Because God knew and understood that I need the people to understand the principles of the Torah, which are basically, I need them to know the actions that I want them to do to have a just society that works, right? Because that's the bottom line of the Torah. One of the Rambam's things is that I need to create a world, right, that's perfect, where society works and people keep my rules, right? So I have to write this book. So I have to write it in a way that some people can understand it on their level and other people can understand it even deeper. However, the word, what do the words really mean? They really mean the deepest depths of both Masa Merkava and Masa Bereshit. Now, I want to give two examples, okay? So we're going to fly ahead. Before we read the next paragraph, where the Rambam is going to say what I just said, I want to go to two places in Mor Nevuchim. One is short and simple, and the other is complicated and long, but they're both very interesting, and they're both indicative of how the Torah speaks in parables in order to demonstrate loftier ideas. The first one is in the Masa Merkava category, in the Rambam's the metaphysical category, in the category of mistakes that people could make in spiritual or philosophical ideas. So the first one in book 3, so the Rambam of Mor Nevuchim is divided into 3 books. In book 3, part 14, which in the Pines lands on page 456, the Rambam quotes a pasuk in Job. It says, "Halo Eloha Givoa Shamayim v'ra'arosh ureirosh kachamim kirama," which means, behold, God is high up in the heavens, is so high up in the heavens, and see and look those high up stars, how high they are. Now, a simple person would look at it and think that the verse is referring to God is high up in the heaven, like literally high. Like, one building could be 10 stories tall, the next building could be 100, and God is 10,000 stories up in the air, right? And look at those stars. They're so. The Rambam makes a point to say, so here's a place where it's talking about Maaseh Merkava, it's talking about God's seat in the heaven, right? But so a simple person will look at that and see, oh, so God is high up. He's really high. And he'll walk around thinking that God is really high. And there's people that walk around thinking that. But the Rambam then goes ahead and in that chapter that I mentioned, in chapter 14 of part 3, explains that the purpose of the pasuk, it uses height as a metaphor for God is so high up that we can't understand him, right? Behold, God is so high, he's in the heavens in a place that we can't access, right? So the point of the pasuk to someone who understands that God is not understandable is the opposite. It's not that he's physically high, that you can measure it in miles or feet, but it's that God is so high. And how can you how can a human being get close to that understanding? By looking up at the stars and thinking they're so inaccessible to us, so far from us. That's God. So here you have a Maaseh Merkava idea, which is being written as a mashal, is being written as a parable to give us access to a much loftier idea. Okay, to give us access to the idea that the Rambam feels is important for us to know, which is that God is inaccessible to us. So the Torah there in Job is using the metaphor of height and the metaphor of stars that we can see, but they're so high and we can't access, to give us a metaphor of this idea about God. But now, after that, I want to go, so that's a Maaseh Merkava idea, an idea where the Torah describes a idea that's spiritual, that's philosophical, but it describes it in a parable-like way. I don't know, there must be a better word for that. But now I want to go to something much more interesting and a little bit more detailed. It's going to take a little bit of time, but it's worth it. It's really worth it. And I think I'm noticing that we're probably going to get through the book this way. I'm going to be jumping back and forth to different parts of the book so that we can understand what we're reading in the beginning. But I think this is just a much better way to get through it. So now in the Pines, this is the chapter. It starts on page 348 in the second volume, in volume 2. And it's section 2, chapter 30. And here the Rambam talks about the first verse of Bereshit, Genesis, okay? So this is great. This is really great stuff because next, in a week or two, we're going to be starting a class, learning a chapter a day, right? It's starting, I think, Thursday, the 9th of February, I think. I might have it, or no, the 3rd of February, whatever it is. I think it's the 3rd of February. Whatever it is, it's starting. So we're going to start, of course, on the first chapter of Bereshit. And this is something that's really fascinating to study. But the Rambam's understanding of this verse is mind-blowing and absolutely beautiful, and it's very, very worth studying. So I'm gonna read through it today. The Rambam begins. Now, here is a place where the Rambam has already identified to us on numerous times. He's repeatedly said that Maaseh Bereshit is science, is physical science. And the Rambam says that when Bereshit bara Elohim et hashamayim et haaretz, that's referring to physical science. Now, you and I don't see that in our science textbooks. So how does that work? So let's see how the Rambam explains that this works. And the Rambam is going to deal with a very interesting philosophical concept, and that is a debate about the nature of time itself, right? And the Rambam, in one of his famous arguments with Aristotle, despite the fact that the Rambam was very much Aristotelian, he had several disagreements, but his most famous disagreement with Aristotle is that Aristotle believed that time, there is no starting point to time. Time always existed. This is how Aristotle thought. And time always existed. And in fact, the world always existed, according to Aristotle. It's the olam kadmon. There's never a moment in time when things began. There was always time. The Rambam holds that this is basic Torah philosophy, is that there was a moment when everything started, including time itself. And that was the moment of creation, okay? So time itself is dependent upon, according to the Rambam, the motion of the spheres, or what we would call matter and energy in more modern parlance. So, and according to the Rambam, time itself began then. So how do you read that into the words, Bereshit bara Elokim et hashamayim et haaretz? So the Rambam says like this. No, first, know as follows. And remember how the Rambam, and if you remember in our first lectures, the Rambam keeps on talking about language, how important language is, and the terms that the Torah uses. So this is the Rambam in classic Maimonidean understandings of a verse. He says, you need to start off knowing that there's a difference between the words hatchala, right, tchila, which is the beginning of something, and reshit, okay? So I'm sorry, 1 second. I want to get the right Hebrew term. Give me a minute. This is Peleg Beis, chapter 30. I'm not going to read necessarily every word of this Rambam because it's a little, but I'm going to go through it. Yeah, between Rishon, what's first, and what's the okay. So what does that mean? So when you talk about the reshit, right? You're not talking about you're talking about the primary, meaning the main thing, right? The main thing is, right, like the heart is called, the Rambam brings it, is called the foundation of the body. And that's very much Galenic medicine from Galen, which the Rambam was totally spot on, that the heart is the source of the whole body, comes from the heart. So therefore, the heart is the first, in the sense, not that it's the first in time, but it's the main part. It's everything rests on it, right? However, when you talk about Rishon, when you talk about the beginning, then you're talking about the beginning in time, right? So when therefore when the Rambam says when the Torah uses the language Bereshit, right? It doesn't say it's not using the term Bereshit in terms of time. It's not saying in the beginning, right? So the Rambam doesn't translate it as in the beginning. He brings the language from Hosea, right, where from the prophet Hosea, where it says in the beginning, right, of the word of God to Hosea. In other words, as God started speaking, these are the beginnings of his words. But in Bereshit, it doesn't say that, but rather the word Bereshit does not mean, right, that it was in the beginning, meaning that there was time going on, and in the beginning of the world, right, but rather it means in the origin is the word that Pines uses. So the origin, the start of everything, when everything started, when everything began. So this creation created everything. So then the Rambam continues to say that as follows: the many people, and here I'm reading from the Pines language. On the other hand, the statement which you find formulated by some of the sages that affirms that time existed before the creation of the world is very difficult. You'll find places where it sounds like the sages understood that there was such a thing as time prior to the world being created. Why is that difficult? Because that's the opinion of Aristotle, which I have explained to you. He holds that time cannot be conceived to have a beginning, which is incongruous, right? Those who made this statement were conducted to it by their finding in scripture the terms one day, a second day. They saw the fact that the Torah talks about on one day, it sounds like this. So there was things were happening, and then there was a first day of the creation process, the second day. In other words, time was coming the whole time. So he who made the statement understood these terms according to their external sense as follows. Inasmuch as a rotating sphere and a sun did not yet exist, there was no sun yet, there were no Galgalim yet. So whereby was the first day measured? How did they measure this was the beginning of the first day? There must have been something, there must have been time going on. Then the first day started of creation, where God created A, B, and C. And then the second day where God created B, C, and D, or whatever, so on and so forth. So, and he brings a medrash, Rabbah in Bereshit, which sounds very much like this, like Aristotle, because it says they expressed their opinion in the following text. It says the first day, Rabbi Yehuda ben Rabbi Simon said, we learned there must be that there existed before that an order of time. There must have been time before creation. And Rabbi Avo said, there we learned that God created worlds and destroyed them, created worlds and destroyed them because there was stuff around, there was time before the process of creation that's being described in the Torah. And the Rambam says, consider what was the difficulty for these two sages? What problem did they have? It was the notion that time existed prior to the existence of the sun, because it says in the Torah, the sun was in the fourth day. So how did they measure time before that? So it must be that time existed before creation. The solution of what seemed obscure to both of them will soon become clear to you. So here the Rambam says, but if you try to interpret what those sages just said, it will sound to you, and by the way, almost all the medieval scholars that were non-Maimonidean did interpret that medrash that way and assumed that there is such a, and they even brought proof where other rabbinic statements say that the Torah was created before the world, or certain things existed before the world. That shows there must have been time before creation. Now, but the Rambam says that all who adhere to the Torah should reject such an idea. It's impossible that there's time before creation, because everything started in the beginning. So don't take this into account. I've already made it known to you, the Rambam says, that the foundation of the entire Torah is the idea that God brought the world into being out of nothing, without there having been a temporal beginning. For time is created as well, being consequent upon the motion of the sphere which is created. Everything, including time, was created at the moment of creation, according to the Rambam. And now let's go to what the Rambam says. And then this is the really cool part. So then he says, if that's the truth, so then he says, among the things you should know is that the sages themselves explicitly stated in a number of passages that the word et, when it said et hashemayim, the et haaretz, it means the heavens and everything within the heavens, and the earth and everything within the earth was all created in that one moment of Reshit, that one moment of origin. Reshit meaning the origin. So this, they mean by that he created together with the heavens all that is in heaven, together with the earth all that is in the earth. You already know they make it clear that the heaven and earth were created together, because he says, I call unto them, they stand up together. Okay. Accordingly, everything was created simultaneously, then gradually all things became differentiated. There was one chunk of matter, and that chunk was created in the beginning. I'm sorry, I have to silence my phone. I apologize. After that, the rest of the process of Bereshit, the rest of the process being described in the 7 days of creation, is a process of things separating into processes. So all matter and time itself was created at that one singular moment. I mean, of course, this sounds very, very reminiscent of what we believe today and describe as the Big Bang. I'm not saying that the Rambam is professing modern scientific physics, but it sounds extremely similar. So then he continues on to say they have compared this to what happens when a farmer sows he goes into a field and he puts a lot of different plants around the field. And one day plant A starts to grow. The next day plant B starts to grow. The next day, so there's what appears to be one field. And then as time progresses, things start to differentiate. So every single thing in creation is a process of differentiation. And then the Rambam continues to say, therefore, what Rabbi Yehuda and Rabbi Simai meant when he said that that there must have been a process of time before, what he meant was not that there was a process of time before the moment of creation, but what he meant was there was a process of time before there was a way of measuring time before the sun and the moon, right? In other words, he looked, the sun and the moon were in place on the fourth day, right? So how was time measured before that? So that's why there was a day one, a day two, to tell us that there was progression of time from the moment of creation on, even without the sun and the moon. And then the Rambam brings the Medrash and Bereshit Rabbah, who says that the sages themselves understood this when they said the light of the sun was created on the first day, but it was somehow hung onto the sun and attached to the sun and plunked in the sky on the fourth day, which the Rambam interprets as meaning this idea that he just said, which was his basic science, right? So the basic science of everything being created at one moment. Now, I'm going to stop here from reading that part of the Guide to Perplexed, and I want to go to explain. So what did we just see from this? What we just saw here is that verse, Bereshit bara Elohim et hashamayim et haaretz. The Rambam sees in that verse his understanding, his scientific, according to his current understanding of science, how the world was created. In the beginning, not the beginning, in the origin, is a better word, right? Or it's not even in the origin, at the moment of the origin, right? When the whole origin, when the basis of everything that exists in the world, like the heart of the universe, started, at that moment, at hashamayim et haaretz, there was everything, all heavenly things, all earthly things, and everything associated with heavenly and earthly things. It was all there in that moment, undifferentiated, right? As a thing, right? That primordial spot of thing, whatever that is, right? Which includes in it everything that's created, which includes time itself and every bit of matter, all of, in the Rambam's mind, all of the elements, all of the everything, period, was there. So that's how the Rambam reads. Now, think about it for a minute. I just went on for 45 minutes talking about that one verse, right? That one verse, when you and I looked at it, certainly when we were educated, we looked at the verse, this is not what we saw, right? And the Rambam is basically telling us, this is the Torah speaking in parables. This is the Torah teaching us science in parables. That's how the Rambam looked at it. Now, obviously, so as the Torah, it's easy to take this and read about the Big Bang and understand it there, right? It's easy to do that. But if next year there's another theory that outdoes the Big Bang, I can't promise you how easy it's going to be to read into that pasuk or not. I don't know. But we can see right away why the Rambam, what this means by talking parables. Had the Torah described what I just described to you, many, many people wouldn't have been able to have a handle on it. They wouldn't have gotten it. These are difficult concepts for the general public to understand. It's not, maybe with teaching and learning, which is the Chachamim didn't say you're not allowed to teach it, Maseh Bereshit, to people. It said you teach it to one person. It specifically states that Maseh Bereshit can be taught to anyone, even the uneducated. Maseh Merkava, only the special few that won't make really big philosophical mistakes. But Maseh Bereshit can be taught to everyone, but it shouldn't be taught in public. It should be taught carefully, the people understand it carefully. And now we can read what we came here to read today, which is the continuation of the guide, the Perplexed. So I'm going to start from. I really want to find the exact spot. So I don't know why I don't see paragraph numbers. How about this would be maybe the paragraph numbers, paragraph 8, okay? In the introduction, prefatory remarks of the Guide to Perplexed. If someone has the link to it, tell me. But it's not the beginning of that paragraph. As you go on, it is I won't find the exact sentence. It's hard because of the different translations.
How does it start in the Hebrew?
Well, I have a different Hebrew than you have too. So hold on one second. I'm going to find it. I'm going to find it. You must know that if a person who has attained a certain degree of perfection, so it's about maybe 10 lines down. If you start from the degrees in the perfection of men vary according to these distinctions. So, but I'm starting from, you must know that if a person who has attained it, if people have it, it's like about 10 lines down into paragraph 8. If a person who has attained a certain degree of perfection wishes to impart to others, either orally or in writing, any a portion of the knowledge which he has acquired of these subjects, and this is referring to, so in other words, if I wanted to teach to you, I'm sorry that I have to say in my words, but it's just this only way. If someone wants to teach to you these topics, and the Rambam is explaining to us why the Torah taught it to us this way, okay? He is utterly unable to be as systematic and explicit as he could be in a science of which the method is well known, right? This is just not a good translation. I don't know what to tell you. It's just a bad translation. The Pines is much better. Because what the Pines translates for he basically says that I'm going to read from the Pines, and you can try to follow in with me. I'm sorry. So
Can you just say where you are in the Pines?
in the Pines is page 8. Know that whenever one of the perfect wishes to mention, either orally or in writing, something that he understands of these secrets, according to the degree of his perfection, he is unable to explain with complete clarity and coherence even the portion that he has apprehended. In other words, even though he knows it, it's very difficult to explain these lofty concepts. It's extremely difficult, as he could do with other sciences whose teaching is generally recognized. That phrase is much better translated in the Pines. Like if I was trying to explain to you something simple, like how do you build a table? I can explain it. But if I'm trying to explain to you what I just did about the nature of time and creation, it's very difficult. It's challenging. And you have to have those moments of inspiration. Rather, there will befall him when teaching another, when he's trying to teach someone that which he had undergone when learning himself. The wise person himself was challenging to study and learn and get this and understand this. I mean to say that subject matter will appear, flash, and then be hidden again. You'll have moments of epiphany, was the word we used before, moments of inspiration, right? As though this were the nature of the subject matter, there'd be much or little of it. For this reason, all the sages possessing knowledge of God, knowers of the truth, when they aimed to teach at teaching something of this subject matter, spoke of it only in parables and riddles. That's why they spoke it that way. They even multiplied the parables and made them different in species and genus. In order to impart the idea, they said as many stories as they could, as many different ways of explaining something as they could. In most cases, the subject to be explained was placed in the beginning or the middle or the end of the parable. As you read through the story, somewhere in the story, you'll see the lesson. This happened where a parable appropriate for the intended subject from start to finish could not be found. Sometimes the parable doesn't exactly match the idea, but within the story, you can get the idea. Sometimes the subject intended to be taught to him who was instructed was divided. Sometimes the parables are different places, a little story over here, a little story over there. Although it's teaching this one and the same subject, many parables remote from one another. Even more obscure is sometimes you can have, as the case of one and the same parable corresponding, you can have one parable that explains many different subjects. Its beginning fitting one and the end fitting the other. So I'm skipping a little bit. The situation is such that the exposition of one who wishes to teach without recourse to parables and riddles, if you tried to teach without using stories and without saying it the way it's said, it's so obscure and brief as to make obscurity and brevity serve in place of parables and riddles. In other words, it's so obscure, so hard to understand him that no one really understands what they're reading. And you could think about it literally. If you tried to read a book in physics that was written for only physicists, people could never understand it. It wouldn't make sense. I mean, maybe you could work on it and work on it and work on it and get there, but most of us will never get it. The men of knowledge and the sages are drawn, as it were, towards this purpose by the divine will. This is the reason why the rabbis taught their lessons this way in Chazal. The reason why they also spoke in parables and riddles is because they are drawn to teach. And then the Rambam says, don't you see this? Isn't it obvious? God himself, and this is crucial. I was trying to read quick. I wanted to get to this statement. God himself, may his mention be exalted, right? Wished us to be perfected. God wanted us as human beings to be perfect, to be good, to live good. And the state of our societies to be improved by his laws. This is a foundational principle of the Rambam. The purpose of the laws of the Torah is so that society and the world should be fixed, should be proper, should be appropriate by his laws regarding actions that people do. Now, how could that happen? This can only come about if people understand the basic intellectual beliefs, the underpinnings of the law. So God has to teach it, and people have to teach. And they can't teach it by explaining it directly, because if they try to explain it directly, it's so obscure and so difficult. So therefore, what are these intellectual beliefs that must be understood? The first is understanding God, right? Which is Masim Merkava. But you can't understand God unless you understand, that's divine science, Masim Merkava. The only way you can understand Masim Merkava is if you understand natural science, Masim Bereshit. You need to understand how the world works in order to understand how God works. And this is so because they are so closely related to each other. So, and it's the study of natural science has to precede the study of the God. Therefore, the Rambam says, that's why God started the Torah with Bereshit. He started the Torah with natural science, which, as we have made clear, is natural science is Maaseh Bereshit. And because it's so important, and because it's so hard for us to really understand the depth of it, we are told about these profound ideas, which God decided is necessary to teach us. It's spoken in parables and riddles and in obscure words. That's why Bereshit is written in such an obscure and way, right? As the sages said, it is impossible to tell mortals of the power of Maaseh Bereshit. For this reason, that's why the Torah writes it obscurely. In the beginning, God created, and that's it. They thus have drawn your attention to the fact that the above mentioned subjects are obscure. Chazal wanted us also to know that if you look at the words and read them literally, you're not reading what's really there. Likewise, when Shlomo said, that which is far off and exceedingly deep, who can find it out, right? Who can understand it? And that which is said about all this is in equivocal terms, is in those terms that could mean many things. And here's the end, and I'm going to finish with this today. So that the multitude, the average person, might comprehend them in accord with the capacity of their understanding and the weakness of their representation. Whereas the perfect man who is already informed will comprehend them otherwise. That's why God wrote it in such a way. It's important that everyone gets these basic ideas. How can I teach it in such a way that everyone will get this basic ideas so that society will learn the lessons it needs to learn? By writing it in a way that the wise person can understand what it really means, and the simple person will understand it on a simple level. And that's why I'm going to end tonight. I'm just ending my part of the presentation, but I would like to hear from everyone what their thoughts are. Anyone have a question, contribution?
Yes.
Go ahead.
So the two concepts that come to mind are Bina and Da'at. Bina being understanding and Da'at being knowledge. And that is just from a pedagogical perspective, a teaching learning perspective, right? We need to have a context, as it says in Avos, im ein Bina, ein Da'at, im ein Da'at, ein Bina. Without an understanding, there's no knowledge. Without knowledge, there is no understanding. In the sense that you need to have a context in which to assimilate that which you see to be able to understand it, and you need then to be able to use that as a basis for further learning. If that made any sense.
Well, it does make sense. I think if I understand you, their da'at is knowing, knowledge, facts, right? Whereas bina is understanding them, and bina is different levels. Facts are facts. At least maybe when you watch cable news today, I don't know, but
no, and I think Rambam, yeah, well, yeah, no, I think Rambam understood it that way.
Yeah, and Bina understanding those facts that people have on different levels, and so the fact that Bereshit bara Elohim et hashamayim et haaretz is a fact. God created heaven and earth, right? But what those words mean, a person with deeper understanding will understand something like the way the Rambam explained it, the way I read it. I think it was important that I jumped ahead to show you how the Rambam actually studies that pasuk, so that you can understand what he means over here when he speaks in more general terms. Any other comments? Anyone else have any? Go ahead.
Well, the whole creation story is in its simple sense is divided into days of the week. And
Mhm.
does the Rambam also ascribe to the exact plan that is outlined in Genesis, or?
Not really. Actually, what the Rambam, within what I read, I didn't emphasize this part. When the Rambam uses that parable of the farmer growing different types of plants, right, in the field, and that over time different things grow, the Rambam deliberately uses the language days. That one day this grows, one day this grows, and it sounds very much like the Rambam is trying to say that the Torah used the concept of days as a parable so that we can understand it as progression of time, right? So that one day doesn't mean a 24-hour period, 2 days doesn't mean a second 24-hour period, but it said it because there was that moment of creation that he described, and then in a progression of time after that, things differentiated, just like days are a progression of time, because days was a way for us to comprehend, because we all comprehend. You wake up today, your field looks a little bit different than it looked yesterday. And the next day, it looks a little bit different than the day before. So the Rambam, yes, that would be what, it's implicit in what he said, because he chooses those same language when he uses Rambam's own parable, of the field.
Listening to your teachings tonight, it strikes me that Clarence Darrow was a Maimonidean, because when you read his cross-examination of William Jennings Bryan in the Scopes trial, and the way he sort of tied William Jennings Bryan in knots, questioning him about the literal meaning of the creation story, he really is a Maimonidean. And he's teaching William Jennings Bryan that the creation story is written in parables, that it can't be taken literally. And if taken literally, it makes no sense.
I don't know enough about Clarence Darrow to tell you if you're right or wrong, but I have always believed that the vast majority of people who claim to be atheists are only atheists because they are often atheists because they didn't read the Rambam, and they don't, and they simply, had they read the Rambam, they wouldn't have rejected so many things that they learned, that they were taught, and that the Torah says, because they would know that it doesn't mean what they thought it meant, And in that case, especially when it comes to issues like evolution, when I hear people, it's like, to me, when people debate, science versus the evolution, not evolution, creation, it's the silliest and most low level. It's literally what the Rambam himself gets so frustrated by calling people vulgar and stupid and all, because that's what it sounds like. It sounds like, they just don't know how to read the Torah. I mean, we can sit and debate atheism, but I don't mean me and you, I mean, it's in general, but when it's just such a misunderstanding, and with the Maimonidean understanding, a lot of this either falls away or at least gives you an approach, But yeah, you're probably right about Clarence Darrow. Yes.
Rav Shaul, I don't want to, if other people want to jump in, but I had a comment about what you just said.
Yes, go ahead.
So to your point is, I think the frustration that Rambam experienced, I'm reading into this. So
yes,
I'm wondering if the frustration the Rambam experienced wasn't just with Torah, but with an understanding that people get mired in a myopic view without being able to understand that which is not directly before them. Right? What reading the Torah in this way requires at some level, what he's saying that we have to do is to go outside of directly what we see, touch, taste, feel, to understand.
I certainly can understand that. That makes sense to me. And when we're studying Torah, you definitely have to go beyond a step past. Let's see. Are there other hands up?
Hey, I would like to add, I really actually like this view.
Yeah.
That kind of the Torah comes to you where you are. And ultimately, it's not necessarily about, like, you're never going to understand it. I mean, he's kind of saying that at the beginning, right? Like, you're going to get so far, but you're never going to understand it. And I'm kind of
never
wondering
going to
if
get all the way.
Well, just the idea that it's unknowable, but this is
Mhm.
the best we're gonna do. I like the idea that, I like the explanation of the parable in this way. I guess that's what I wanted to say. Very interesting. I've never heard that before. I haven't obviously studied a lot of his work before, but I really just kind of like that concept because that just makes me kind of feel good about this. Also, do you think that the Rambam believed in personal evolution, like you come at it from this low level and then you grow with it as you read it more and study it more?
Oh, he definitely does. I mean, the Rambam says we've read it a little in his words already, where he talks about that process of personal growth. Remember in his letter, which we started with the first lecture, his letter to his student, and he talked about his own student's personal growth and how how he saw him grow, and to the point where he was ready to get into the the more difficult subjects. But certainly, yeah, I mean, and the goal, according to the Rambam, is he's going to get into this a lot later on, especially when he talks about prophecy, of how a person achieves higher and higher intellectual levels. So definitely, he doesn't condemn everyone to being dumb and stupid. You can rise above that. Any other comments, questions, issues?
It seems like this is an attempt to, it's not an attempt, but it's his explanation demythologizes the creation story. And does he take the same approach with other, say, miraculous events in?
Yeah, he's a very much a miracle minimalist, to the extent that it's possible. The Rambam pretty much eliminates most miracles from the Tanakh. Not all, especially the Yetziat Mitzrayim, the Exodus miracles, but almost all the miracles the Rambam explains away in scientific manner. And that's miracles and the Rambam are a huge subject, and we will definitely cover them. There's also a lot of debate among Maimonidean scholars as to exactly what the Rambam really thought about miracles, because he says some somewhat conflicting things. But that has to be a subject for itself. We'll get there. We cannot leave this. Yeah, I wanted to say, I'll open for more comments, but in case people are logging off, after the Tanakh program, the 9 to 9 program starts on February 3rd, where they're going to learn a chapter a day. Obviously, learning a chapter of Tanakh a day is going to be, it's very cursory knowledge, which is good to get a broad base of knowledge, like the doc that David was telling us before. But I'm going to be doing, after the Rambam class that we have, we'll have like a 5-minute break, and then we'll start a new Zoom to learn in depth something from the last 5 chapters. Does that make sense? So because there's 5 chapters a week, it goes Monday through Friday. So it's going to be a bit from Bereshit. I already chose my first set bunch of subjects. The first one that I hope to talk about is who and what was the Nachash, the snake, the serpent of Eitz Hadat. The Rambam had a lot to say about the snake, and more Nevuchim, which it'll kind of go into that. But there's a lot of literature on who the snake was, and that'll be, but that's going to be on February 9th. So next Wednesday is just regular, and then the Wednesday after that, I'll start doing that, and it'll be just a small piece from the first 5 chapters we read, and then I pick the snake, and then I'm going to do something from each one after that. So that'll be our Tanakh Be'iyun. But I'm only going to be able to cover in this time, not even a portion of a verse, but it'll still be fun.
Can you explain, and maybe the person to ask is Rav Shmuel or maybe Lowell, I mean, how is the yeshiva's 929 project related to the regular 929?
International 929 project?
Yeah.
I got to ask them, because I'm not running that program, but I think they're just following that schedule, because it's a nice.
So it's modeled on it, but it's not merging with it.
I don't think it's merging, but it does give you the opportunity to tap into online resources that the 929 project in Israel have.
I see.
So if you're going along with them, you can get involved if you want to, discussion groups and whatever resources they put online, study guides they put online. So it just broadens the availability of resources. I mean, on the Bible, there's plenty to read online about it,
Yes,
or in
there-
books, or there's a lot there, but
Yeah.
you know, doing it along with the project. But yeah, the specifics of it, you got to talk to them. I'm not running it.
As
Yeah.
I, from reading it, again, I'm with you, I don't understand specific, but I think it parallels very much Daf Yomi. That is, you know, with the Daf Yomi, you know what Daf you're going to read on a particular day. I think the same thing is true with the 929. It's a new cycle, and there's 929 days of Tanakh.
So it's certainly good. And I will put in a personal plug for my own what do you call it, podcast, Let the Prophet Speak, where I don't do the first 5 books. I don't do Torah, but Nevi'im and Ksuvim. I'm not finished yet, but I've done about 450 podcasts so far in the last several years. So it's on Let the Prophet Speak. And I start with Yeshayahu, with Isaiah. So I don't go in the exact order, but right currently I'm in the middle of Shoftim, the book of Judges. But you can pick up where I am. You can start from the beginning, which is Isaiah. I explained in my podcast why I chose Isaiah first, which is basically because it's my favorite book of Tanakh. But then I go on with everything else. So if the 929 is awesome, but if you want a chazer, if you want a review, you can go to my podcast, but not in the beginning, because they'll be doing the Genesis first, and I didn't do that. Anyway. Any other
Shaul, I had a
comments?
quick question.
Oh yeah, please.
So I'm just trying to get a sense of, from the most primitive, almost cartoonish, the description of Hashem with human characteristics, which I
Right.
think most people understand were just the initial attempts to explain. You can't go straight to like E is equal to MC squared to a primitive, relatively primitive people.
Right.
But at the highest level, does Rambam recognize that there are also things that are not explainable or not understandable by humankind? So you might say those are the chokim. So is there a limit to how much he thinks we could conceivably, with the greatest of knowledge and study and if everything, actually comprehend in that like big spectrum of cartoonishly simple and clearly not real to absolutely impossible for humans to comprehend?
So this is a great question. The Rambam explicitly addresses that question. And he says that the encounter between Moshe and God at Har Sinai, where God says, Lo Yirani, a human being cannot see me and survive, is a statement by God saying that the ultimate truth is complete, is knowledge of the divine, which is impossible for a human being to achieve. And in Maimonidean philosophy and ideas and science too, Moshe came the closest, right? He was there with God, but God still, God said, you can't see my face, you could see my behind, which the Rambam understands means that God is saying, you can know a lot about me, but you can't know me. And according to Rambam, that is the same thing. Ultimately, Masa Bereshit leads to Masa Merkava, like you said tonight, right? It starts with, you need to know Masa Bereshit, and then that's intimately connected with Masa Merkava, and eventually that leads to God himself. But the actual knowledge of God himself, a human being cannot achieve. So the ultimate truth, a human can never know. But we can get really close. And the closest anyone ever got was Moshe. But he addresses that question directly. I can't remember where, but I'll try to find it and I'll send it to you. Anything else? Any other questions, comments? We can go on forever with this, but.
I want to amend something I said earlier.
Yes.
Based on, which is to say that the foundational elements of 1 and 2 being or 1 and 2 being foundational to 3 and 4.
Yes.
I think Maimonides believed that, but to the point that you made so astutely this evening, Torah is presented so that we can understand, because we can understand 3 and 4, it allows us then to go in and understand 1 and 2, which is in fact foundational to 3 and 4, but you don't get there immediately.
Okay. Good. Understood. Thank you. All right, I'm going to have to end it, even though we can keep going on. But I think we've had our full fill for the night, and looking forward to doing this next week, and then the week after that doing this. And I'll try to make it shorter so that we can jump to the Tanakh, the Be'iyun. The Tanakh Be'iyun, for those that aren't familiar, means Bible in depth, which we're going to do that, the snake story, hopefully, God willing. Anyway, everyone have a good evening. Thanks so much.
Thank you so much. Bye.
Thank you.
Thank
Thank you.
you. It was great.